on a second. Let me see if you can get this. All right. In response to Exsurge Domine, Luther writes 3 works. The first is addressed to the Christian nobility. Essentially, in this document, he calls on the nobles, the princes, like Frederick the Wise, to carry out the reforms that he thinks need to be made in the Catholic Church. And so, from 1517, when he nails the theses to the door, to 1520, he has begun to become more and more convinced that it's not just indulgences that need to change. The second work he writes is on the Babylonian captivity of the church. And essentially, one of the things that he's beginning to question is the role of the office of priest. Within Catholic practice, priests were responsible for a lot of the things like baptism. They were required for the observance of communion or the Eucharist. And so what Luther says is that the priests are keeping the sacraments, right, these holy practices, they're keeping them captive. Because if a priest doesn't like what you're doing, if he's corrupt, he's going to not allow you to have communion. Or if you're some priests were exploiting money from people to baptize their children. And so, priests have become very corrupt with their power and money grouping. And so the priests are keeping the sacraments captive from the church. The papacy, Luther says, is Babylon and the Antichrist from Revelation. Furthermore, he says that there are a lot of practices that have developed within Catholicism that aren't true holy practices, that really baptism and the Eucharist or communion are the only sacraments, holy practices, that bring grace to people in Scripture. Right? So, we're seeing here, his opposition to Rome is growing. First it was just, I have a problem with this priest. Now it's the whole Catholic system is wrong. On the freedom of the Christian, though, is a letter to Leo, Pope Leo, that essentially says, I'm not attacking you as Pope. I'm attacking the corruption that's in the church. And that corruption has surrounded the papacy, has surrounded the hierarchy. But in this letter, he is also beginning to push forward some ideas that are quite different than Catholic teaching. First is the idea of justification by faith apart from works. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means when we get to doctrine in a couple classes. But essentially what he's saying is the Catholic teaching was you're made right with God through your works. Luther believes the Scripture teaches you're made right with God through your faith or your trust. The other thing that's in this work that would also be problematic for Catholicism is the claim that all Christians were priests. And so the priesthood of all believers. And so, again, we're kind of seeing this kind of increase of opposition and challenging of teaching. But a lot of what he is doing is kind of these cautious reforms. He's saying a lot of things, but he's not wanting a lot of changes to be made too rapidly. Not everybody, however, was following that. As more and more changes are being made, as Luther is challenging the authority of the priests, the bishops, and really any authority in general, other things start happening. Many monks and nuns left their religious orders. They give up being monks and nuns. Many of them get married. And eventually a peasants' revolt occurs in Germany. And the Catholic leaders blame Luther. He's the one that instigates it. Even though Luther feels, that's not what I meant to do. And so he kind of condemns the actions of the peasants. And the peasants kind of feel like Luther's betrayed them. Right? And so he's wanting to be very cautious about this, but, other people want to get moving. Right? It's like, you're not moving fast enough. One of those things that is part of that cautious reform is the translation of a German Bible, putting the Bible in the German language. And so for several years, he begins translating the Bible. Eventually, at some point, Luther has to escape to the Wartburg Castle. Right? So he kind of lives in exile for a while. And that's when people really start going, because here's Luther kind of in exile, and people are taking his ideas and running with them. Luther is helped in his translation of the German Bible and other things with a young Greek professor named Philip Melanchthon. Yes, there are to be two P's at the end of Philip. I know that looks like a typo. But Philip Melanchthon is kind of Luther's assistant, really advised a lot of Luther's teachings, and after Luther's death will become a major leader in the form of Protestantism that Luther is introducing. Again, a lot of this is this kind of moving forward cautiously is what Luther wants to see. And so he tries to encourage churches to choose their own pastor, right? Choose your own religious leader. Don't allow the Catholic Church to tell you who the priest is going to be. Make the choice from those churches. But eventually, he has to appeal to the leaders in the different regions to intervene because there's so much chaos. He introduces new music. Some songs of which are still around. "The Mighty Fortress is Our God" is a song that Luther wrote, and we'll talk about some other things. But in other ways, Luther is very conservative. He continues to believe in infant baptism, continues to use candles, other things that would have been a part of Roman Catholicism. So he's not dumping everything. But Luther is continuing to become a figure of great concern. He's ordered to appear before the imperial diet in Worms, not the diet of worms, or not the diet of worms. It's the diet of Worms. Right? And he's given an order to recant. Eventually, an edict is pronounced from Worms that Luther is a heretic. So there is this solidification of the break. But still, we're dealing here with not just religious consequences, but political ones as well. In the latter part of his life, Luther gets married. He marries a former nun, Katharina von Bora. Luther is 42 at the time. Katharina is 26. They have 6 biological children. And then adopt a few others as well. But the Luther home becomes a place for a lot of people to come and visit. And frequently, Luther would kind of give these little devotional sermonettes, right? He would do a lot of talking about religious things in meals at the table. And so eventually a work is published called Table Talks. And so that's, again, some of these things that Luther discussed with these people that would come and sit at the Luther table. He also produces what is known as a little catechism. Catechism was a document, usually of questions and answers, meant to teach people the doctrines of the faith. And so there have been catechisms in Catholicism. There are eventually other catechisms in Protestantism as well. Usually children were the focus of the catechism, right? And so it was meant to teach children. But in Protestantism, of course, a lot of people are coming to Protestantism as adults. Eventually he will produce a larger catechism as well. So the break seems to be pretty solid, but that doesn't prevent Luther from continuing to get in trouble. There are 2 diets in Speer. The first diet in Speer it's very positive toward Luther. And largely it withdraws the Edict of Worms. And so it says, all right, Luther's not a heretic. Now, the things that Lutherans originally a derogatory term, right? The people that are following Luther get referred to as Lutherans, and Luther didn't like that term. In fact, Luther preferred the term evangelical because of its connections with the Greek word for gospel, right? So he sees himself, he sees the people agreeing with him as returning to the gospel, and so he wants to use the term evangelical. But Lutheran eventually, of course, sticks. But in the Diadosphere, what the Lutherans are proposing are a couple of different things. They want the ability for priests to get married. They think that Scripture doesn't have a prohibition of priests to get married. They want, and this might sound odd, they want the restoration of the cup in the Eucharist to the common people. Since about the 1200s, Catholics received communion in one kind, meaning they only received the bread. Now, eventually that will be changed in Catholicism as well. But Luther says, no, the sacrament, the Eucharist, the communion, is wine and bread. And so they want the wine, they want the cup restored to the laity. Another thing that Lutherans want is the ability to use German in worship. So for Catholicism, it was predominantly Latin. Everything in worship was Latin. But the Germans want, permission to use German. They wanted to see other types of things occur in practice changes. Particularly, they wanted to see the end of private masses. Right, the mass. Point that out. Let's see how far back we get. So in the second Diadosphere, the Catholic Church, the Catholic princes are more in power, and so they kind of overturn everything. Luther's a heretic again. The Lutherans are told to come back to the Catholic Church. And some of the princes there reject all these ideas. They protest this return to the Edict of Worms and some other things. And so the group that is breaking away from the Catholics are now referred to as Protestants. Right? And so the Protestant Reformation. By this time, Lutheran Protestants aren't the only group challenging, pushing for reform. There's other groups as well. And so there's all sorts of things going on. Protestantism is starting to break apart. There's no unity. Right? So even though Luther kind of starts a lot of this, a lot of other people are getting into it as well. Toward the end of Luther's life, Luther and the Lutherans come into some more negative press due to some things that occur with an elector named Philip of Hesse. Philip of Hesse has a wife who's very sick. And so she's not able to do her quote-unquote wifely duties with respect to everything that wives were expected to do in that time. So he wants to marry a second wife. Right? Her health is so deteriorated. She's not able to move around, interact, do much of anything. And so he wants to marry again. He can't get a divorce because he's kind of sided with the Protestants. And the Protestants at the time are pretty convinced. Divorce only occurs if there's adultery. And so adultery hasn't occurred. It's a health issue. Because he's sided with the Protestants, he can't go to the Pope for the Pope to grant his divorce, which if he'd remained Catholic, he could have probably in this situation gone to the Pope. The Pope would have given him an annulment, and he could have gotten remarried. But he's not Catholic anymore. And so he goes to Luther about it. And Luther and a couple others essentially tell him, well, you can't get divorced because divorce is against God's law, right? Because this is not a matter of adultery. An appeal to Matthew chapter 5, Matthew 19. But if we look at the Old Testament, there were several prominent individuals Abraham, David, Solomon, who had more than one wife, and God didn't condemn it. And so Luther and the others say, it's not against God's law for you to marry a second wife. But it is against man's law. Right? And so there were some laws in place on the books at the time that would not allow a person to have two spouses. And so essentially they tell him, you can go and do it, but keep it quiet. So I think you probably figure out how this could look bad for Luther. Eventually it kind of comes out, and so Luther's kind of, his reputation's really damaged once word comes out. But it's also suggested that Luther even told Philip that people ask about it, why? Right? And so there's even some indication that Luther kind of really has some, doesn't live up to his ideals and all of this. Luther continues writing, continues speaking for, even into the end of his life. He tries to produce writings, but a variety of health problems affect him toward the end. He has inner ear problems, gallstones, heart issues, and then passes away in 1546. And so, the main figure in all of this is Martin Luther. Before we move on to two of the other main ones, I want to pause and ask if there are any questions, anything I need to clarify or explain.
A second marriage because of the wife's health problems, is that still okay?
Yes. So he wants to get a second marriage.
Okay. And what year did he do that?
1546.